Naomi Klein, thanks for joining me on UpFront. You write in your latest book, This Changes Everything, that a growing number of scientists now agree, quote, there is still time to avoid catastrophic warming, but not within the rules of capitalism as they're currently constructed. I want to come back to the capitalism point in a moment, but first, how much time do we have left, in your view, to avoid catastrophic warming?
So the decade we're in is sometimes called decade zero when it comes to climate change, in that we really do need to get emissions pointing in the right direction. Global emissions are still going up year after year. And the really key question around how much time there is left has to do with whether or not we continue to build infrastructure that locks us into fossil fuels. So that, for instance, the International Energy Agency says that our deadline is 2016 if we want to stay within...
So now, basically.
Basically now.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that there's been such a strong focus in the climate movement, taking aim at these big infrastructure projects like pipelines or huge liquid natural gas export terminals.
Because of the long-term implications.
Right, because if you look at the business plans for these projects, they're built to last 40 years. And we actually need to be off fossil fuels by mid-century if we are going to stay within our carbon budget that's compatible with what our politicians said when they went to Paris in December.
Well, on Paris, we had in December this what was called by many a landmark climate change deal in Paris. Its supporters say achieved its major goal of agreeing to keep the global temperature increases well below 2 degrees Celsius. President Obama called it a potential turning point for the world. I'm guessing you disagree with that assessment.
Well, I would underline potential, like in red over and over again. Look, there are things that are really important in the Paris deal, and exactly as you say, that goal stated clearly that if we are going to stay safe, we need to keep temperatures below 2 degrees warming, or do everything we can to keep them below 1.5. And that was really significant because for island nations, the slogan is 1.5 to survive, because if anything above that, they disappear beneath the waves, low-lying island nations. So the goal is good.
It's the execution you worry about.
Well, it's not just the execution, it's the mechanism to meet the goal within the Paris Accord is something called INDCs. These are nationally determined targets. So the way it works is sort of like a potluck approach. So rather than tell countries, okay, this is our carbon budget and this is your slice, China, and this is your slice, United States, that was deemed too top-down because we live in the era of deregulation. So the UN didn't want to tell governments what they were going to do. They just said, okay, everybody go home and make your best effort, and fingers crossed, when we add it all up, it'll match up with our stated goal. The problem is, if you add up all the national targets that were set voluntarily by individual countries, it actually leads us to 3 to 4 degrees of warming. So double what politicians said they wanted to achieve. So it's
like a potluck without enough food. They've set themselves.
Or everybody makes guacamole, like as so often happens in a poorly organized potluck. Yeah.
So not as much hope on that front. Is it fair to say your issue with climate change is more ideological, more moral than it is purely environmental? It's about dealing with the underlying economic issues that have brought us to this potentially catastrophic juncture.
Well, I mean, it's certainly fair to say that I come at this issue as somebody who has studied the impacts of deregulated capitalism around the world. We live in this era of what Joseph Stiglitz has called market fundamentalism, where it's all been about slashing regulations for corporations, privatizing the public sphere, keeping taxes low for corporations and the wealthy, all on the theory that what is good for elites is going to eventually trickle down and be good for everybody. And we locked it all in under corporate-friendly free trade deals. So what I do in the book is look at the fundamental clash between those policy pillars and what we need to do in the face of climate change. Like, if you're going to reinvent your energy grid, if you're going to reinvent your transportation system, it's probably not a good idea to sell it off to companies who are only interested in making as much money as they can. If you are interested in having maximum policy flexibility, it's probably not a good idea to implement free trade deals that make it possible for corporations to sue national governments, as is happening, challenging important climate regulations.
So isn't there a problem then for you when you explain it in that way, that there are a lot of people on the right, for example, all of the Republican presidential candidates, who say when they're asked about climate change, they say all of this stuff to tackle climate change isn't about protecting the environment, it's a cover for left-wing people to try and restrict capitalism, change our free market way of doing things, bring in big government and socialism. And the problem is someone like you is saying, basically, yeah, they're right. You're agreeing with them. The subtitle to your book is Capitalism versus the Climate. How will you win over people on the right?
It's worse than that. I actually have a chapter in the book called The Right is Right about the fact that I believe that they do understand, they're not right about the science. They're right that if climate change is true, their whole ideological project that says, government has to get out of the way, let's free the market, that whole project has a big problem. And the idea that we can deal with climate change within the confines of our current system is exactly what we've been trying for 2 decades, and it's failed miserably. So instead of regulating fossil fuel companies, we set up carbon markets in Europe, and it became a magnet for fraud, and it was a boom-bust cycle like so many deregulated markets. We told people that it wouldn't disrupt their lifestyles, they just had to shop more but for more green things, right? That also didn't lower emissions.
A bit more.
We focused on people as individuals as opposed to looking at what we can do collectively. So I actually believe we've tried the don't rock the boat approach, and now it's time to try something different. And the good news is there are a lot of people who have an appetite for system change for a variety of other reasons besides climate change.
Okay. Putting the right to one side, the London Review of Books, a left-wing publication not unsympathetic to you or your arguments, in its review of your book, This Changes Everything, it said you're an expert at exposing corporate wrongs, but less good at suggesting how to right them. You think, quote, a world-spanning predicament, such as catastrophic climate change, can, quote, be tackled with the same protest tools as the Vietnam War. What's your response to that criticism?
But it hasn't really been a protest movement. It's been this let's all hold hands, let's make deals with big business. We'll have cap and trade and climate markets and green capitalism. That's the approach that's failed. I think we've only really started building a real climate movement in the past 5 years, certainly in the global north. And you see, the rise of fossil fuel divestment, which grows exponentially. There are now $3.4 trillion that have committed to divesting. You have, protest movements like taking on Arctic drilling when Shell parked their drilling rig in Seattle and Bellingham and Portland, Oregon. That led to change in policy. So it's not to say, okay, a protest is going to stop climate change, but the fact that, for instance, there were 400,000 people on the streets of New York, I think is part of why we're seeing a different Obama in his second term than we saw in his first term. Obama in his first term, without this kind of street pressure, did almost nothing in the face of climate change. Obama in his second term, dealing with the movement against Keystone XL, Arctic drilling, this mass movement demanding climate justice in the streets, is introducing all kinds of great legislation that would have been a hell of a lot better if he'd introduced it on day one.
Rather than his lame duck year. Taking a step back, you didn't, of course, become a global name, a literary star over the issue of climate change. It was over globalization, quote-unquote anti-capitalism, with your first book, No Logo. What got you interested in, what got you so passionate about climate change and climate justice? Was it a particular event, a particular person?
Yeah, well, I should say, I see a lot of, there is a lot of continuity for me, even going back to No Logo, which I wrote when I was, a kid. Because that book was about how, in the 1990s, there was this explosion in the kind of consumption that we had. I didn't understand when I was writing that book in my 20s that was intimately linked to an explosion in emissions that I now understand in retrospect. But the turning point for me was, very clear. It was when I was writing The Shock Doctrine, and I was in New Orleans when Katrina struck. And it was covering that disaster, reporting on it at the time and then in the book, that showed me where the future leads, where the road we're on, where it leads to if we don't swerve, right? Because Katrina was not just about heavy weather of the kind we're going to see more of because of climate change. Oceans warm, you have heavier storms, and that Katrina was a vicious storm, Category 5 hurricane. But when it hit New Orleans, it had already been downgraded to a tropical storm. What turned that into a catastrophe was this toxic mixture of heavy weather meets weak and neglected public sphere meets institutionalized racism. And so that is what climate change looks like without system change. It looks like a public sphere that can't respond. It looks like the victims of that failure being vilified, called animals, looters, on Fox News. So that was my wake-up call, and that's why I'm not afraid to say, if we want to avoid climate change, we need system change.
And what about you personally today? How do you in your everyday life combat climate change? Because a lot of well-intentioned people, myself included, that's what we find so difficult, because there's this expectation to give up driving or give up flying or now give up meat, which apparently also contributes to climate change. How do people on an individual basis, how do you inspire them to take those kind of steps?
Well, first of all, because a lot of those steps actually improve our quality of life. I mean, if we don't spend all of our time in our cars and bike and walk and use transit, if we live in a city where that's possible, if we live in a context where we have the right policies in place, then we'll actually be happier and healthier. And I find I am happier and healthier when I do those things. Same with eating less meat. My huge sin is flying. I wrote in the book that I finally lost my frequent flyer status and cut my flying by 10%. But since the book has come out, even though I tried to do as much as I can by Skype, I've been flying way too much. And I don't make excuses for it. I think it's terrible, frankly. But what I do say is, if the price of admission to this conversation is that we already have to be off fossil fuels, then this is going to be a conversation with two people in it, because we live in a society that is fueled by fossil fuels that make those good decisions really hard in a lot of cases. We don't have a good, fast rail system. Too many places don't have transit or safe bike lanes or all those things, which is why I focus on the policy, less on those individual decisions. But I'm not saying they're not important. They are important, and anyone who wants to call me a hypocrite, bring it on. It's true.
Less about the hypocrisy, more about the difficulty, I think.
It is difficult, and that's why we need the policy.
And let me put this quote to you. The Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman was asked about how to get people to take climate change seriously, and he replied, "No amount of psychological awareness will overcome people's reluctance to lower their standard of living. So that's my bottom line. There is not much hope. I'm thoroughly pessimistic. I'm sorry." Is he wrong in your view?
Well, I think he is wrong, because the truth is that if you map out a response to climate change that is based in justice, then it's actually going to improve the quality of living for the majority of people. I mean, it is the 10% of the world that are the biggest consumers, and I'm part of that.
Who are going to have to cut their standard of living.
Yeah, but it isn't everybody.
Good luck to a politician who sells lower standards of living, surely.
This is the reason why I make the argument that we have to connect the fight against inequality, the fight for racial justice, with the fight to lower emissions. Not by saying climate is more important than jobs, not by saying it's more important than your quality of life, but saying this is not just a middle class issue. This is an issue that if we take seriously, offers the best prospects for huge numbers of people who are getting a really bad deal right now.
Do you think the work done by people like yourself, by Joseph Stiglitz, by the economist Thomas Piketty and others, do you think that work to highlight the inequities, injustices of neoliberalism, extreme capitalism, do you think that's what's helped drive the rise of the likes of Bernie Sanders here in the United States, or Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader in the UK, or Podemos in Spain, or many other such movements around the world calling for radical economic change?
I think what drives it most is just people's lived experience, I think where the research comes in, where the work comes in, is it says to people, you're not crazy. Things really, if we look at the impact of Piketty's work, I think a lot of people, saw that research and went, yeah, I'm living it, I'm seeing it everywhere. But at the same time, I think when it's reflected in the media, it does create space, and it has created space for a candidate like Bernie Sanders to come forward and forcefully make inequality the election issue, make the need for campaign finance reform, front and center. But I think in terms of the market for those ideas, that's what people are living, not what they're reading.
Naomi Klein, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.